Welcome to our Transgender Inclusion webinar for JCC Day Camps. I'm Aaron Greenberg, the Day Camp consultant, and I'm here with Dina Yakar, who is the guru for our webinars and keeps these things running. And I'm going to introduce Daniel Bahner from Keshet. I'll give you his bio, and then we're going to get started. Just so you guys know, we're going to take questions via chat for now, and then eventually we will open it up when Daniel calls for questions so we can hear you as well. Okay, so Daniel Bahner from Keshet brings experience in program development, community building, and social justice education to Keshet. Daniel's originally from Southwest Ohio and quickly formed a connection between his Jewish identity and the importance of inclusion and working towards a more socially just society. Daniel joined Keshet over a year ago after spending 3 years working at a small liberal arts college as the Assistant Director of Residence Life. There he trained students in building inclusive residential communities as well as assisting students whenever they've had concerns about their community environment. In his role at Keshet, Daniel works with Jewish communal organizations around the country as they work to become more LGBTQ inclusive. Daniel also did our webinar last week for our overnight camps and did a great job, and we're looking forward to a very educational, informative session. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, all of you, for joining us, and thanks to the JCC for having me here to talk to you all about this really important topic. So just before we get started, just a quick overview of Keshet as a whole, if you're unfamiliar with our work. We are a national LGBT Jewish organization that works for the full equality and inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Jews in Jewish life. I am joining you in from Boston, where most of our professional staff is. We also have a staff member in New York City and a few staff members in the San Francisco Bay Area as well. And two other tidbits about me, just so you know kind of the identities that I hold as I go into this conversation. I identify as a cisgender gay man. If you don't know what the term cisgender means, I will go over it shortly. And then my gender pronouns are he, him, and his. Again, we'll talk more about pronouns and why it's important to share those when talking to folks in a little bit. And just to reiterate what Aaron was saying about the platform, if you do have questions throughout, use the chat feature to type it in. Towards the end, we'll unmute you all to have some dialogue, to ask questions over the phone, over audio, and then we'll go from there. And if at any point, if I'm talking too fast, I did live in New York City at one point, so I picked up that quality. Please enter it in chat feature, and I will slow down. So with that, let's get started. So hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll be able to know and identify some of the terms used when discussing the transgender community, understand how inclusion fits into a Jewish context, understand the ways in which gender impacts our daily lives, and then discuss best practices as they relate to transgender inclusion at day camps. So the first place that I want to start, and that I think is really important to start, is to make sure that we all are coming from the same place as it relates to language. Oftentimes, this is the first barrier to inclusion. People don't want to hurt people's feelings, so they are afraid. They don't want to say the wrong thing, and at the same time, they're afraid to ask questions because they don't want to offend folks. So I just want to spend a few minutes just going over some broad concepts and then more specifically some identities that maybe you've heard before, maybe you haven't, just so we can understand what they all mean. So the first word that's important to understand about this conversation is sex. You might hear biological sex or sex assigned at birth. So when we talk about somebody's sex, we're talking about people's bodies. Male and female genitalia, primary, secondary sex characteristics, body hair, hormones, chromosomes, things like that. So it's the physical anatomy of a person. The next thing is gender and gender identity. So gender are the social constructs, the expectations, the norms that we and societies have set up throughout our history of civilization around people with different bodies. And then gender identity is the internal sense of one person has as it relates to their gender and who they know themselves to be. It's a very deep-seated understanding of oneself. So words like man, woman, transgender are words that, and cisgender, are words that relate to a person's gender identity. And it's important to note, particularly around transgender inclusion, that we as in our Western society have conflated sex and gender together. We often use them interchangeably. We say sex when we really mean we're talking about somebody's gender. Sometimes we say somebody's gender when we're really talking about somebody's sex. And we also, as a society, it's structured to assume that everybody believes and everybody knows themselves to be the gender they were assigned at birth. So it's really critical to understand that these two things that we're talking about, sex and gender, everybody has both, but they are distinct from each other. And just because you know somebody's sex does not mean that you know somebody's gender identity. And just a quick note before I move on, Erin reminded us that this webinar will be recorded and the PowerPoint will be available on jcca.me as well. So back to the triangle. Orientation then is the last of the three. Orientation speaks to attraction. It speaks to to other people in relation to you, kind of who you're attracted to. And there's a lot of different components of attraction. There's physical attraction, there's sexual attraction, emotional attraction, romantic attraction, spiritual attraction, emotional attraction. These are words like gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, queer. Those all speak to somebody else's attraction. So then, as I said, sex and gender identity, again, those two words are defined there. Words related to sex would be male, female, and intersex. It's important to recognize that male and female are actually the words that describe sex, and man and woman are words that describe somebody's gender identity. Again, we use them interchangeably a lot, and there are times when grammatically the form of man and woman takes male or female, but when we are really thinking about them as words, as nouns, they're referring to two different things about each other. So then transgender, going back to some of these identities that maybe you've heard about before, transgender and trans, shortened version of it, it's in our national conversation more and more. So it's an umbrella term for anyone who knows themselves to be a gender that is different than the gender they were assigned at birth. Some trans people may have an alternate gender identity that is neither male nor female, and for some people their gender identity may vary at different points of their lives. Some transgender people modify their bodies through medical means, and some do not. This is in contrast to cisgender, which is the word that I used to describe myself earlier. So this is a person who is comfortable in the gender they were assigned at birth. It is used to contrast with transgender on the gender spectrum. And if you're not sure where the word came from, cisgender has its origin in the Latin-derived prefix cis, S-I-S, meaning on the same side. So to maybe better illuminate what these two things are talking about, these two words are talking about. So when I was born, and the doctor when I was delivered and the doctor had me in the doctor's hands, the doctor looked down and saw male genitalia and declared it's a boy. So actually, if we refer back to this triangle, in that moment, the doctor actually declared two things about me. He assumed two things about me. So one, he identified that I had male genitalia, so that was my sex. And then the second statement, it's a boy, because our society believes that all boys have penises and all girls have vaginas, when we know that's not true, he assumed that my gender identity was going to be that of a boy. In my case, that is true. As I grew up and knew and understood myself, I didn't feel like a boy. Maybe I didn't always fit what society said a boy should be and act like, but my sense of who I was as a self was, I never questioned that. So cisgender is the word to describe that experience. So the statement of it's a boy held true for me, and I identify as a man, cisgender gay man. That would then be a contrast to somebody who identifies as transgender, for in that same scenario, maybe the doctor looked down and saw male genitalia, said it's a boy, but then as that child grew up, starting at young ages, 3, 4, 5, started to understand themselves to be a girl in this example. So they knew that they were a girl. They maybe were experimenting with clothing, but not every young child that experiments with different clothing holds a transgender identity. It's very developmentally appropriate for young children to play with gender in that way. But from a very young age, these deep-seated ideas of who we are very present. So if that same child knew themselves to be a girl, then they might identify as transgender. So that's the difference between those two. Then transsexual is a word, it's an older word that you maybe have heard about before. It has fallen out of favor more recently. More and more people are considering it to be offensive for some people, but others do hold this identity. So what does it mean? So it means the person who feels that his or her gender identity does not match his or her assigned biological sex. Some transsexuals, though not all, have sex reassignment surgery and or take hormones to make their bodies look more traditionally male or female. You might have heard other terms like male to female to male, trans man, trans woman, and man or woman of transgender, transsexual experience. More and more, I think you're hearing transgender use as the umbrella term, and I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about transitioning, we're talking about the social transition and a medical transition. So the transsexual piece really speaks a lot to the medical transition, which is a very expensive process, and it's not easily accessible to a lot of people. And not everybody wants to go that route. So something that's really important to keep in mind is, one, not every transgender person is going to undergo a transition either socially or medically that is kind of a shared experience. It's each individual person's journey, and it's a very private journey. It's not appropriate to ask anybody about a trans person about kind of their medical procedures or what their body looks like. That's not your business. So that's just a really important difference to understand, is that there is not one monolithic transgender experience, just as there's not one monolithic gay experience. And I'm also talking to you about this as a cisgender person, so I have not lived this experience. So those are a few really important distinctions to make. Some other words you might be starting to hear that are very generational, and younger generations use these words more commonly. Genderqueer is a broad political and cultural identity that includes many, but not all, transgender, transsexual, gender nonconforming people, as well as others who see their gender as falling outside of mainstream norms. People identify as neither male nor female, both male and female, or who claim an alternate gender identity of their own. This is really getting to the idea of breaking down our society as a gender binary of people that do not subscribe to that idea. And so genderqueer is a word that kind of speaks to that. It's a gender identity term. Then lastly, gender nonconforming, another umbrella term that can include anyone whose gender identity or expression or behavior is outside of social norms of women who are feminine and men who are masculine. Transition we talked about. Intersex is a word that's referring to biological sex, sex assigned at birth. It's a general term used to refer to people who have atypical sexual reproductive anatomy and biology. It's not a single category. Older terms that are considered offensive now you might have heard are hermaphrodite. But I wanted to include it in this conversation because what sometimes could happen with a person, an intersex individual, is when they're born, if the sex characteristics were not distinguishable at birth, the doctors in consultation with the parents might sometimes choose which gender they're going to raise their child in as, and then have medical intervention to bring the child's body in line with that gender, which can be really problematic if that child grows up and knows themselves to be a gender different than what was chosen for them in this very direct way at birth. That sometimes they can have experiences similar to a transgender person as well. Transition, I talked about pronouns. I referred to this earlier. Pronouns are one of the most basic ways that we respect each other. It's how we refer to each other in the third person. And it's one of the ways in which trans people in particular are shown disrespect. We have a tendency to look at somebody's gender expression. So gender expression is how we choose to express our gender, the clothes we wear, how we wear our hair, the names we go by, pronouns, and whatnot. So we each have that. We each choose to express that, but then all of us also attribute that gender, look at somebody and place our own assumptions about what are the cues that we're looking at to categorize people. It's how we're socialized to behave, and so we often will look at somebody and, based on what they're wearing and what they look like, determine if they are, we've been told either if we should use he to refer to them, or she. A lot of what's important about this conversation is to not make that assumption about anybody. So having practices similar to what I did at the beginning of, if you're introducing yourself to a large group, especially at the beginning of camp, sharing your pronouns so people don't have to make that assumption about you, is a way that you can send the message that this isn't a trans-inclusive space. You can also ask other people to share their pronouns if you go around the room, have it on registration forms or whatnot. And it's important that even if somebody, especially with a transgender individual, if they begun their social transition, to begin and to use the affirming gender pronouns that they have told you they need to, that are appropriate to use when referring to them. So he, him, and his are considered the male pronouns. She, her, hers. Some people use a combination. More and more, you're hearing they, them, theirs used as a singular pronoun. You'll see some others, Z or her. I don't see them as much, but those are gender-neutral pronouns. So the biggest thing to take away about pronouns is it's important not to make an assumption, and that there are other ways you can get about asking somebody's pronouns, and we'll get into those later. All right. So lastly, just to bring this all together so that we can hopefully understand and reconceptualize these ideas a little bit different than we have in the past. So what is in front of you is the gender-bed person. It can help you understand what these different words are talking about. So you'll see identity is, the arrow is pointed to the brain. So our brain is our seat of who we are. It's our personality, who makes us who we are, and your identity is very deeply seated. Your gender identity is deeply seated in your sense of self. So your gender identity is represented in the head in this picture. In other versions of this picture, you would see a heart in the middle, representing attraction. So again, orientation is about attraction. It's represented by the heart, who you love. In between their legs, the genitalia region, biological sex. And then the dotted line around is gender expression, how people choose to express one's gender. So this is maybe a way that you can lock some of these new understandings into your brain. And then lastly, as we start transitioning away from the terminology pieces and more to the nuts and bolts, what does this actually mean in practice, I want to put these two words up here, heteronormativity and cisnormativity. If you've never seen them before, don't worry. They're words that sometimes even Microsoft Word doesn't recognize. But what they really mean are they are talking about the ways in which, even though we might say that we as a day camp community are welcoming and inclusive of everybody, oftentimes it's the ways in which our day camps are structured to assume that everybody is heterosexual or assume everybody is cisgender, or to put out the message that that is the preference and that is the norm. It's identifying those areas that are still sending the messages that this is not the most inclusive space. So a lot of what we'll talk about towards the end, the latter half of this webinar, is identifying the ways in which we can change the heteronormative and cisnormative practices of our day camp. So for example, a heteronormative practice would be if you have registration forms, if they list mother and father. That's a very heteronormative practice that is assuming and sending the message that families only have a mother and a father. But we know that's not true. There are same-sex families. There are families that are led by grandparents, aunts, uncles, foster parents. So that would be one example. An example of cisnormative would be if your facility only has a men's room and a women's room. It's making the assumption that everybody would feel safe and comfortable using one of those two facilities, when a trans person might not feel safe to do so if there's not, even though they should be allowed to use the restroom, affirming of their gender identity, they might not feel safe in that environment. So a presence of a gender-neutral bathroom or an all-gender bathroom would make the day camp more trans-inclusive. So it's identifying those kinds of areas that we're going to look at. But before we do that, I do want to help frame this a little bit from the Jewish perspective, because oftentimes I sometimes hear, why are we talking about this in a Jewish context? And so I think it's important to take a step back and look at this from a place of our values. And so Keshet has a poster called 7 Jewish Values for an Inclusive Jewish Community. And what it is, it's a collection of 7 values that we did not create, that many people we identified as being very central and core to any Jewish community. As I do this work, a lot of people agree that these are present in their community. In fact, many people argue that in order for a community to consider themselves Jewish, these have to be present. So of the 7 of them, there's one in particular that I really want to lift up because I think it speaks a lot to this topic of transgender inclusion. So as a Jewish people, as a Jewish community, we value and we believe that we are all made in God's image. So the Torah tells us that we all are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. This is a simple and profound idea that should guide our interactions with all people. If we see each person as created in the image of God, we can see humanity and dignity in everyone. True inclusion is built upon this foundation. So why is this a particularly resonant value? We hear it a lot when we're talking about Jewish communal life, but let's actually look at where this passage comes from. So the phrase "in God's image" comes from Genesis, from Bereshit, the first time that humans are mentioned. So oftentimes I would dare say that the story about the creation of humanity that we are more familiar with and that comes to mind fastest might be, I know what it is for me, or at least it was before I started for Keshet, was the image of Adam being created and Adam naming all the creatures in the garden and being lonely, and so God pulled Eve from the side of his rib and created Eve that way. But really, that's actually the second time that humans are mentioned. The first time that the creation of humanity is mentioned, it says God created the Adam, the first human being, in God's image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, God created them. So then what do the rabbis say about this? So Rabbi in the Talmud, in the Midrash, I should say, Rabbi Jeremiah ben Eleazar, when the Holy One, blessed be he, created the first Adam, the first human being, because that's what Adam translates to in Hebrew, God created him as an androgynous. So then what did the rabbis understand an androgynous to be? A person who has both male and female sexual characteristics. In the Talmud, the androgynous is understood as someone who both has a penis as well as some female sex traits. It's referenced 149 times in the Mishnah, in Talmud, 350 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. So I highlight this because, one, if we believe that all human beings are made in God's image, and if in our tradition, in Torah, the first time that happens, there is both female and male aspects to them, what does that now mean to how gender operates in our community? If both male and female and how we all each embody all of those traits that we've assigned to male and female, what does that mean for trans inclusion? And if we believe that everybody is made in God's image, and then the necessary respect that comes with that. But also, too, I think it's really important is because our concept of gender is a very Western one. Our Western society is gender binary, but it's important to remember that not every society throughout the history of humanity has structured in that way. There are many societies around the world that have more than 2 genders, that have up to 5, with different roles and societies they play. In some societies, they have spiritual or other special significance in their community. But even in our Jewish tradition, there are other examples of the rabbis talking about this and talking about what we now consider gender diversity. Did they understand it as such? Probably not. But they are grappling with these conversations about what does this mean and what does our society look like, because this is the reality of the way life and human diversity happens. So another example from the Talmud, so Rabbi Isaac said, why were our ancestors Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah infertile? Because the Holy One, blessed be he, longs to hear the prayer of the righteous. The rabbi further stated, why is the prayer of the righteous compared to a pitchfork? Pitchfork turns its sheaves of grain from one position to other, et cetera, et cetera. And the Rabbi Ami said, Abraham and Sarah were originally tombs, for it is said, look to the rock you were hewn from and the hollow of the pit from which you were dung. And this is followed by the text, look to Abraham your father and Sarah to who bore you. And then Rabbi Nachman said in the name of another rabbi, our mother Sarah was an Elonite, for it is said, and Sarai was barren and she had no child. The verse says both was barren and had no child to tell us that she didn't even have a womb. So then what do these 2 words mean? So what is a tumtum? A tumtum is a person whose sexual characteristics are indeterminate or obscured. In the Talmud, the tumtum has indeterminate genitals, 181 references in the Talmud, 335 in Midrash. And then the second term, a person who is identified as female at birth but develops male characteristics at puberty and is infertile. So then what does it mean if the rabbis are understanding our founding matriarch and patriarch in these ways? But what does it say about our tradition then that describes Abraham and Sarah, who before they were known as Abraham and Sarah were known as Abram and Sarai, and had some kind of transformation of their bodies, of their persons, and then went by different names. Again, what does it look like to have a Jewish community that remembers this and speaks about this and its relation to transgender inclusion in our community? So these are just more examples of in our tradition that you can pull from to frame this conversation about why this is important. Lastly, I want to close this section with a reflection from a young trans person and the impact of what being in a non-inclusive environment had on them. So this individual, Natan, hated going to day school after I realized that I was trans. The teachers would always separate us into boys and girls or make funny comments about what girls or boys are like when they talked about the Torah. I felt left out and misunderstood. I wanted to be seen as a boy, but gender was imposed on me everywhere. I couldn't go to the bathroom, stand in the lunch line, or join the reading group without picking a gender that wasn't mine. I started to associate Hebrew with oppression. Can you imagine that? So I want to share this to help us frame the next phase, the kind of the talkless phrase of our conversation, the nuts and bolts phrase, because our society is socialized in a way that gender is everywhere, and for individuals who are constantly being told that who they know themselves to be is not right or that it's not normal is really oppressive, and it's something that really hinders them from feeling fully participating in the community, because every single place they turn, something very basic about who they are as a human being is being put into question. So I want to start with, and Aaron, if we could open it up to unmute everybody, I want to pose this question to all of you and maybe have a little bit of a conversation about it of, think to yourself then, looking back to this quote, gender was imposed on me everywhere. I'm curious to hear from you, when is gender imposed upon a camper at your camp? So if we could unmute and let folks maybe share a few thoughts, I'd love to hear that. So if you have any thoughts, you could just speak up to the group.
Hi, this is Gail from JCC in San Francisco.
Hi, Gail.
We have when we go down to the pool to change, we have boys and a girls locker room. We do have some individual stalls, but for the most part, it's between two.
Yeah, so locker rooms, bathrooms, absolutely. They have to pick, again, in this similar example, even in that moment of having to choose where to go to the bathroom, which many of us don't have the privilege of not thinking about that.
Gender kids are big.
Other thoughts about where gender is imposed upon a camper? Maybe the registration form that you have, if you ask about a child's gender, perhaps the parent is filling it out on their own or for them. So the parent is putting a gender onto them rather than the child claiming it for their own, perhaps. Maybe some of the programming you do has some gendered components to it. Even before they come to your camp, I think you can turn the mute off unless other folks are want to share. Even the products that kids are being, the clothes that they wear are marketed around gender. The bathroom products, the things they're watching on television, all these are sending these messages about gender and what does it mean in our society. So before we move on, does anybody have any final other thoughts about gender at your camp? No? Okay, so if we could go ahead and mute everyone again. When we think about the strategies for making day camps more inclusive, it's helpful in general to think about institutional change work in 3 different buckets. So the first one I want to focus on is culture. So what is the culture of your camp? The first step towards creating a fully inclusive culture and environment is a commitment to a vision and the values of equality and respect for all people, in cultivating the language necessary to communicate those values and put them into action. So that might mean putting a welcoming statement on your website or on your documents or brochures, and including that we are a fully inclusive camp regardless of disability, ability, special needs or ability, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, etc. And then making sure you have the other policies in place to back that up. Education is really crucial. It's really important in the culture of the organization to make sure that your frontline staff members are trained. So if they are the counselors that are going to be with the campers during the day, or if it's the frontline staff of the JCCs that you're operating out of, providing educational opportunities for the parents, for the campers themselves, Those are all really crucial components to this. That's something that Keshet can definitely help you with and support you in the future. We do trainings around the country around these topics. Last year alone, my colleagues and I did between 8 and 10 trans inclusion at camp trainings around the Mid-Atlantic New England area. If that's something you're interested in, you can email me directly. My contact information will be available at the end. There are additional fees associated with it, but we do have trainers that can lead your staff around this very topic. Another part of the culture, a lot of the part of the culture is being mindful of language and how you talk to each other, to staff, to your fellow staff members, but also to campers. So one thing, do not assume the pronouns, somebody's sexual orientation, somebody's gender identity, and avoid gender generalizations or stereotypes. Only girls wear dresses would be a gendered stereotype. Here, a fuller list of some things to consider to do when working with youth. Do create a group covenant, safe space agreements, etc. at the beginning of the program. If you have smaller cohorts of campers and that they're going to be with together all the time, if they do some kind of conversation at the beginning about setting expectations for the group or how you all as a camp behave, making sure that that agreement speaks to inclusion in some way, and a lot about how we communicate with each other. Do let young people self-identify related to gender, sexuality, orientation, and more. If you do need to split participants by gender, let them self-identify. Do name and gender pronoun go around in the beginning, explain why you're doing it. Do this even if you don't know about transgender participants. So this is something that I've done with children as young as 8, 9, 10, middle school ages as well. Just saying, like, pronouns are a basic way that we show each other respect. It's important that we don't assume what the pronoun is just by looking at somebody, so that's why it's important for us to go around and just tell people what pronoun do you want them to use when referring to you. Maybe somebody that's questioning their gender might not feel comfortable disclosing that and sharing the pronoun that would be most affirming to them, but that's one that's their choice, that they don't feel safe. It's unfortunate they don't feel safe, but at the very least, the idea, the practice of doing this is setting the message that this is an environment that does not assume everybody is cisgender, and it's providing the opportunity for creating a community that everybody is welcome to be themselves authentically. Part of this is also raising and being prepared to have hard conversations. I think a lot of times, particularly when we're talking about younger children, we are hesitant to talk about what we as adults understand as really complex issues, but for younger children, it's not as complex as we think it is for them. Sometimes when they ask a question, it's not because they just don't understand, but it's not necessarily coming from a malicious place. They just need to reorganize kind of their framing and how they understand the world, and then are ready to move on. But just be prepared that that comes with this conversation. It could be pushback from parents, but at the same time, you're going to get feedback from parents saying, I'm so proud to be a part of a community that is moving forward with this in such an intentional way. Part of that is thinking and talking about privilege. I'm not going to get a lot into what that means as part of this conversation, but that also can come with this as well. And similarly, humbling admitting when you don't know something. Young people will for sure come to you with identities, phrases, situations that we don't cover here, that you don't know how to cover. It's okay not to know. And that's something you can always call us as well. If something arises that you really just don't know how to handle it, call us at Keshet, and either myself or another one of my colleagues can help you talk through any kind of consultation you might need. And also support youth going through hard things, even if you don't understand it. Sometimes give participants opportunities to explain the things you don't know. Use some discernment about when might be a good time and when not. If they're having a crisis moment or if they're coming out to you, that might not be the best time to ask what genderqueer means to them. But what is important is if they are in a moment where they come out to you or they're talking about their personal experience, it's really important to affirm them in that moment. So thank you for telling me you identify as aromantic, for example, and sharing how it impacts you. I'd love to know more about what being this aromantic means to you and how you came to identify as that if you feel comfortable sharing. So it's really important to, in working with youth as they're talking about their journeys, to affirm. What not to do, don't assume that there are no LGBTQ participants just because no one comes out. People are always internally having these conversations with themselves, even if they're not out. I know in my own experience, I knew I was gay when I was 11, 12, but I didn't say it out loud until I was 19, and I would deny it to people when they asked me because I just wasn't ready to say it out loud. Don't assume youth have a fixed identity. Somebody might start the summer, they might believe that their orientation and their past experiences have been that they were only attracted to X, and maybe over the course of the summer as they grow as a person having these really wonderful experiences, they might find that they're attracted to other people they hadn't before, and they're still trying to understand themselves. So letting them go through this journey. Don't assume that if an LGBTQ participant is having a problem, that it is about their sexuality or gender identity. Sometimes it's that being an adolescent or being a young person and growing up is difficult. Don't be surprised when someone comes out to you. Don't say things like, oh, you would never know, or I never would have guessed. That in and of itself helps to reinforce stereotypes of what it means to be gay in our society or what it means to be lesbian, for example. Don't ignore or allow homophobic or transphobic remarks, even if they're being passed off as jokes. It's always important to address those. It's that kind of behavior, that bullying behavior, the taunts that kids throw to each other that are really damaging to the psyche of young people. It's one of the reasons why the rate of trans suicide and attempted suicide in trans youth is really high. It's almost about 50%. And so it's so crucial to make sure you're addressing the homophobic and transphobic remarks as they come up, and not make excuses for them, or don't make excuses about depression as teens being teens. We already talked about don't assume that everyone has one mom and one dad. Don't encourage heterosexuality or fitting into the gender binary. Example, if you see somebody that identifies as a girl, don't assume that they are dating a boy, like ask who's your boyfriend, or assume that different gender pairings of friends are a couple. It's those kinds of small assumptions that just help to perpetuate these stereotypes and these overgeneralizations. And I'm not advocating completely erasing heterosexuality from the world. What I'm advocating for, what we're saying is it's important to send the other messages out that just because you might not be a heterosexual does not mean that there's something with you. Going back to the Jewish values piece, this is the fuller poster. Hanging these, we have fuller, larger versions of these in our office. Having these up in public areas and communal areas and in bunks or in the JCC or whatnot could be really powerful to let them know that inclusion is a core value of the camp. It just helps normalize these values. Other things you could put up, safe zone stickers. These are small little stickers that people can put up on water bottles or in doors and office doors, sending signals that this is a safe space for you. It might seem kind of minor, but they can be really powerful. I know of one story in particular of a mother who was thinking about sending two of her older children had gone through religious school, and then their third child, who was gender conforming, was getting to that time that they needed to be enrolled. And the mother wasn't sure if the religious school was going to be a safe environment for their child to go in, and maybe they need to look somewhere else. But they saw the Safe Zone sticker in the preschool window and knew it was a safe space for that child, and then went ahead and enrolled. So even small things like that send the message that this is a welcoming place and it's on our radar. How you communicate, using the values to communicate with your larger camp community can be really powerful. This is an example of a letter that was sent out to parents from Camp Eisner up here in the Boston area. They were moving forward more intentionally with trans inclusion, and they wanted to communicate, and LGBTQ inclusion in general, and they wanted to communicate that. And so what they did was they took the values that were very salient for that camp community, what they teach, what's part of their mission statement, and framed that. And like, we are a place that these are our core values, and because these are our core values, we have a responsibility to keep praying with our feet and to make sure that these values are applicable to the LGBTQ individuals in our community. So doing something similar with your campus is possible, individualizing it with your values or the 7 Jewish values in the previous slide. The documentation, so we're getting into some more policy areas. Policy is another important area about inclusion. It's how policy, I think, is how we codify our values. I think it's really important to have that as a bedrock part of the community. So your registration forms, do you ask about gender? Do you ask about sex? Which one are you actually needing to know? Do you need to know about it at all? If you do have to ask, how do you ask it? Do you only have 2 boxes, an M and an F? Do you have the more preferred would be leave it blank and people write it in on their own. There are other ways that if you have to give options, there are inclusive ways of giving more than 2 options that I'd be happy to talk to people offline about. But even how you ask this on a registration form is really important. Making sure all anti-bullying policies, non-discrimination policies, packing attire, swim attire, locker room usage, all include protections for gender identity and expression, and to make sure all policies are gender neutral. So that might be if you have older teens and you have sexual ethics policies, making sure that you're not assuming that the only people having potential sexual contact with each other are people of the opposite sex. So even those kinds of policies are important to make sure, because people are going to read them and they can read between the lines, and they will identify when things are not fully inclusive. I know not all of you are in positions of housing people overnight consistently, but maybe some of you have overnight day trips. And housing is definitely a really important question about transgender inclusion. So one thing to keep in mind when working with trans campers, it is essential to center the needs on the camper. Talk with them about what will make them feel safest and most supported. So this is an example I used with the overnight cabin, but it still holds for an overnight housing situation with a day trip. If a trans girl wants to be in a girl's cabin, she should be permitted to be in the cabin that is affirming of their gender identity. That would be an ideal kind of best practices. I understand that you're operating on a lot of other, sometimes competing concerns. So again, that's why it's so important to center the needs on the camper and talk them through what's going to make them feel most supported. In cabins especially, or in any general area that has communal bathrooms or changing areas, consider putting up a curtain so that anyone in the cabin or in the hotel room or the location they're staying at can change behind this regardless of their gender identity. This is a way that you can work towards a more inclusive space that's not necessarily putting a stigma on the trans person there. I am a cisgender man, and I don't like to change and fully undress in a men's locker room just because I'm more of a private person and I like to have a little bit more privacy. So anybody can use this curtain to change behind. Having an all-gender bathroom facility is really crucial as well, and making sure you're not only having a men's room and a women's room. What sometimes a lot of places do, especially if you're under some constraints about budgets and you can't build a new bathroom, is to convert another bathroom in your facility to an all-gender bathroom. Oftentimes, a place will take the single-use bathroom that's the family bathroom or the handicap restroom and really just put this sign up or buy a new sign that speaks to this is an all-gender bathroom and explains what that is. If you don't have a family restroom and you have more than one men's room and women's room on your floor, even considering converting one of those bathrooms to all gender and putting the signage up, and then making sure that people know where it is and that they don't need special permission to access it. And then lastly, in terms of programming, what kinds of programs are you doing? So one, avoiding breaking up into boys and girls when possible. There's so many other possibilities. You can do it by birth month. You can do it by geographic locations in Israel. If you want to come up with some fun activities, you can do it by favorite animal. There's just so many, there's an infinite possibility of ways to break people up other than boys and girls. Responding to any issues that arise if campers are made fun of for doing a specific activity. So let's say you have the sports stuff going on and maybe you have some arts and crafts things. If a boy is going to do dress up or play with the arts and crafts things, if other people make comments of, oh, boys can't do that, that's not a boy thing. Why are you doing the girl activities? Does that mean you're gay? Those kinds of comments, it's really important that you address those because it's helping to break down those gender stereotypes because those gender stereotypes impact everybody regardless on if they identify as trans or not. Potential programming possibility, if you have your day camps over the summer, June is Pride Month. Consider doing some kind of programming to honor the LGBTQ civil rights movement. We have a lot of resources on our website on age-appropriate activities you could consider, but most places around the country that June would be a prime month to talk about this in a more public way. And I do want to name specifically athletic competitions if you do some kind of athletic programming. Transgender youth should be allowed to compete on the team that is affirmative of their gender identity. So that's the best practice. That is what should be happening. But I do want to debunk some myths about transgender inclusion in athletics, just because I think that there are some hesitations that speak to outdated gender stereotypes and misconceptions about gender and sex and how they're conflated. So I have a series of myths and facts. So there's a myth that transgender boys and girls are not real boys and girls because, again, this is referring back to our society's belief that your gender and sex are the same thing. The fact of the matter is the gender identity of a transgender individual is as deep-seated as that of their cisgender peers. The characteristics of one's body do not define someone's gender identity. That is a crucial kind of takeaway from this conversation that we really need to help other people understand as well. Myth. There's a myth that athletes will use trans-inclusive policies to gain a competitive edge. The fact is there's never been an issue of individuals pretending to identify as a boy or a girl in order to gain a so-called competitive advantage or to deny participation of other athletes. There's another myth that allowing transgender girls onto girls' teams would pose a safety risk for cisgender girls. So what the transphobic fear is behind this is that a transgender girl biologically might have been born male, and so the belief that they're going to hurt cisgender girls who are weaker, and that just is connected to so many outdated sexist stereotypes around women. That, and the fact of the matter is that there are large overlaps in height, weight, and strength among cisgender boys and girls, and they compete against each other and on the same teams every day. There would be no additional safety risks when transgender youth participate on those same teams. Similarly, allowing transgender girls onto girls' teams will call into question the competitive equity of athletic competition. And in fact, the fact of the matter is that there's no research that supports the myth that allowing trans athletes onto teams that are affirmative of their gender identity creates a competitive imbalance. Concerns about competitive equity perpetuate gender stereotype that assumes individuals with male bodies outperform individuals with female bodies. So these are some, I just wanted to debunk those myths because I think when we talk about athletic competitions, these are a lot of the hangups that people have. And so these are the things that you might need help educating your athletic staff on, or the larger community on some of these myths if they are concerned about this particular aspect of inclusion. So I know that was kind of a whirlwind of best practices. I'm happy to connect with anybody one-on-one. My email address is on the screen right now, daniel@keshetonline.org. Feel free to email me, and like I said, the PowerPoint will be available on jcca.me. The biggest takeaways, though, that I really want to stress, it's just so important to affirm the gender identity of any camper that comes across and accesses your services. Thinking about my own experience, and I know the experiences that you all want individuals to have at camp, you want it to be a life-changing and a really positive experience. If somebody cannot be their authentic self in an environment like that, they are not going to be able to fully engage and participate in a way that can be as meaningful as it could be if they were fully their authentic self. I know for myself, growing up as a closeted gay man in my Jewish community, it wasn't outwardly homophobic, but it really wasn't talked about, and I didn't feel that I could be my authentic self. And so I know that part of me was always cognizant and thinking about, are people thinking that I'm gay? What are the cues that I'm sending off that could be interpreted as such? I must stop myself from doing those. I'm not going to engage in the kinds of activities I want to do because I'm afraid of being labeled as such. So these are the things that are happening inside people's heads. And so that's why it's really important to move forward with this so that your day camp experience can, that the campers coming to your day camp can have the best experience possible. So with that, I just want to thank you all for your attention and for the work that you all have been doing around this topic, are going to continue to do in the future. And in the last about 10 minutes or so, I just want to open it up for questions again. If I didn't get to anything in particular, or if you have any particular questions for the good of the group, happy to take those now.
One second. Why isn't it letting me unmute? Because I'm like,
Are folks unmuted?
I'm trying to unmute them, but
Okay.
It's not working.
Oh. If you have a question while we figure out the mute situation, if you could you can type in your questions as well, and I'll monitor those. But if you don't have any questions, thank you again for your attention, and please be in touch if I can be a support in the future. So hang out if you have some more questions, and if not, hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Looks like there are no questions. Do you want to say anything? Everyone's unmuted. They're all leaving.
Well, Daniel, I
think
think
we've
we're losing
you're-
everybody. I think everyone's unmuted.
Oh, we have one.
Oh, everybody's
There's a
unmuted.
question, too.
Oh, yeah. Question.
Beth Richmond wants to know, what are some alternatives to male or female on registration forms?
Yeah, so there are two kind of levels to this that I would say. So one is if you are asking about somebody's gender, you should avoid describing it as male or female. So for gender, I would say at the very least having man, woman, transgender, and then a blank for another gender identity that isn't listed that somebody might hold, because there are other gender identities. I would avoid classifying anything as other, because that is very alienating and othering. To go even further, I would advocate there could be some tension if you only have man, woman, and transgender, that what you could be implying is that a trans man or a trans woman is not a real man or a real woman. So an even more inclusive way to do this would be cisgender man, cisgender woman, transgender man, transgender woman, and then maybe some blanks. I recognize that not everywhere is going to be there yet. A lot of people don't know what the word cisgender means. But if you're working with younger people, and particularly college-age students, they are seeing these more and more. So they might expect that kind of, and even high school students, they might expect that kind of level of inclusion. But at the very least, man, woman, transgender, and a blank write-in, or the more in-depth one of cisgender man, cisgender woman, trans man, trans woman, etc.
And for now, Beth, just so you know, Campminder isn't changing that quite yet. So a lot of the camp registration systems are going to be problematic until they decide what they're going to do. But I think it's a pretty big challenge for them to overcome. But I did speak with them at the camp conference, and they're looking at the question at least.
Yeah, and I totally get that a lot of you, especially if you use electronic database systems, that your system, your IT system just might not support this. And then it's a matter of getting creative in other ways. So I get that that it's sometimes easier said than done, and you have a lot of other things that you have to consider to make certain things work. So if you have any particular questions about that, like I said, please contact me, and I'd be happy to come up with some creative solutions. Other questions?
Looks like we are without questions. So, Daniel, we want to thank you again for everything. And I know that people will feel comfortable contacting you if they have questions that arise as we go. So again, thanks again. Thank you all for participating.